Okay, so today I want to talk about what I think is the most dangerous question in the world right now. What happens if the United States actually invades Iran on the ground? Not more bombing, not another carrier group, not another press conference about deterrence and precision. I mean, American troops crossing into Iran in force and trying to take and hold the country. Because right now, as we speak, Donald Trump has just gone in front of the American people and said that thanks to the progress America has made, the United States is on track to complete all of its military objectives very shortly. He said Iran is going to be hit extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. He said America is winning. He said they are going to hit Iran so hard they will send it back to the Stone Ages. And I'll always pay attention when a leader starts talking like that. Because when a president keeps repeating that the country is winning, it usually means the situation is not nearly as under control as he wants people to believe. If you are really winning, you usually do not need to keep saying it. And at the exact same time, Peter Hegseth is out there talking about something much bigger than Iran. He's talking about what he calls a greater North America strategy, a security perimeter stretching from Greenland to the Panama Canal, from Alaska to Venezuela. So now you have to ask yourself a very strange question. Why is a country that is already fighting a war with Iran and not cleanly finishing it, also picking fights with Canada, Denmark, Mexico, Colombia, Cuba, Greenland, Venezuela, and half the Western Hemisphere at the same time? People look at this and say, Trump is chaotic, Trump is reckless, Trump is stupid, Trump has no plan. I want to argue something more serious than that. I want to argue that there is a plan, not a moral plan, not a humane plan, not necessarily a plan that succeeds, but a plan. And if you do not understand that plan, then you are going to misunderstand not only the possibility of a ground invasion of Iran, but what kind of transformation some people around Trump may now believe America has to force on itself and on the world. But first, let us deal with the military question, because that is what everybody is asking. If America actually invades Iran on the ground, what happens? The first answer is geographic. Iran is a nightmare battlefield for an invading army, and I do not say that as rhetoric. I say it because you can see it on the map. Iran is enormous, roughly 4 times the size of Iraq, around 90 million people, huge internal depth, brutal terrain, long distances. If you come from Iraq, which is the most obvious invasion route, you run directly into the Zagros Mountains. Those mountains are not a detail. They are the war. They are perfect for a defender that wants to disappear, ambush, fire drones, and missiles, and turn every forward move into a trap. If America tries to come from the east through Pakistan, then it is not the mountains first. It is the desert first. Massive distance exposure, terrible logistics, a very long road to Tehran. If America comes from the south, from the Gulf, it still does not get an easy war. There are still long distances. There's still difficult terrain. There's still an inland campaign that gets worse the deeper you go. So before you even talk about ideology, before you even talk about politics, the map tells you this invasion would be extraordinarily hard. Now add the manpower problem. America has around 50,000 troops in the Middle East right now. That sounds like a lot until you compare it to the mission people are casually imagining. If the goal is not just to raid, but to conquer and hold Iran, you are not talking about 50,000 troops. You are not talking about 100,000 troops. You are not even talking about 300,000 troops. You are talking about something in the range of 3 to 4 million soldiers if you really want to occupy and stabilize a country of that size and that terrain. America's entire active military is only around 1.3 million. So the math is absurd before the first shot is even fired. That is why, from a purely military point of view, a full-scale ground invasion of Iran would be one of the most difficult operations the United States could possibly attempt. But here's the thing that makes me nervous anyway. Even though the math is awful, there are already signs that some form of ground preparation may be underway. We have seen reserve language telling military personnel to be ready to deploy, fight, and win. We have seen prediction markets where real money is being placed on the invasion scenario. In one case, a very large bet reportedly moved toward a U.S. ground invasion of Iran. And yes, we have the strange Washington signals that people laugh about, but that show up again and again before major operations. Pentagon overtime, pizza deliveries surging, that whole ecosystem around the national security bureaucracy starting to behave like something larger is being planned. None of that by itself proves an invasion is coming, but none of it is nothing. So let us use game theory and push the logic forward. Suppose America actually does it. Suppose it sends ground troops into Iran. What happens next? The first thing that happens is that television lies for a little while. The first week or two could look deceptively fine. CNN will run maps. Generals will draw arrows. There will be triumphant language about positions taken and facilities destroyed. For a short time, it may look like the Americans are making progress, and then reality will appear. because Iran has not been preparing for a ground invasion for 5 years. It has not been preparing for 10 years. Iran has been preparing for this for 25 years underground bases and mountain terrain. Missile stockpiles, drone stockpiles, defensive systems designed specifically to target helicopters, armored vehicles, convoys, and supply chains in exactly the kind of geography the Americans would have to cross. And remember something important in this air war? Iran appears to have used only a portion of its hidden military depth, one cluster of underground missile systems, not the whole thing. If that is true, then a ground invasion would not begin against a country that has already shown its full hand. It would begin against a country that has been holding assets in reserve for the moment. The war gets slower, closer, and more dependent on exposed logistics. So the invasion begins. At first, it looks manageable. Then the terrain starts slowing everything down. Then supply lines start getting cut. Then drones begin hitting American convoys. Then every helicopter becomes a target. Then every fuel truck becomes a target. Then every supply vessel supporting the operation in the Gulf becomes a target. And that is when the war turns from a campaign into a trap. This is exactly the pattern America has seen before. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, after the initial invasion, America is very good at the opening blow. It is the war after the opening blow that ruins them. Iran has studied that pattern for decades. They know the weakness is not that America lacks firepower. The weakness is that America cannot keep political, logistical, and psychological control once the war becomes long, expensive, and ugly. So that is stage one, the military trap. Then comes stage two, the economic trap, because the moment America launches a ground invasion, Iran has every incentive to widen the cost of the war far beyond the battlefield. And the most obvious place to do that is the Strait of Hormuz. Most people hear Hormuz and think oil. Yes, oil is the first layer. And if Iran feels that the war has become existential, then mining the strait, hitting tankers, and striking Gulf energy infrastructure all become rational defensive moves from Tehran. At Neve's point of view, Iran has already made very clear that pushing oil toward $200 a barrel is part of the escalation logic. But the story does not stop at oil. This is where most people are still not thinking deeply enough. The Gulf system moves far more than crude fertilizer inputs like phosphate, ammonium, sulfur, and urea matter enormously interrupt those flows. And this is no longer just a gasoline story, it becomes a food story. Farmers around the world do not produce food out of air. They need those inputs. If those inputs become scarce or too expensive, then food production starts getting hit globally, then move one layer further. Helium matters for semiconductor production. Sulfuric acid matters for semiconductor production. Those are not glamorous headlines, but they matter. Once those flows are disrupted, chip production becomes harder. And if chip production gets squeezed, then the whole AI story sitting underneath the American stock market starts to feel pressure. Phones, computers, industrial electronics, AI infrastructure, all of it becomes more fragile. So now the war is not just hitting oil, it is hitting food, it is hitting chips, it is hitting shipping insurance, it is hitting investor psychology, it is hitting the entire pricing structure of the global economy. And this is why a ground invasion of Iran is not just a military question, it is a global depression question. JP Morgan has already warned that under a severe escalation scenario, the world could face an extraordinary oil crunch within weeks. Think about how insane that is. The largest bank in the world talking in time horizons of weeks, not decades. So the chain is simple. Ground invasion begins. Iran escalates through Hormuz, oil spikes, food gets squeezed, semiconductor supply chains get hit, markets break. The global economy starts sliding from recession language into depression language. And then we reach the deepest layer of the story. What happens to the American empire underneath all of this? Because the American empire is not just soldiers and ships. It is a financial structure. It is a dollar structure. It is an oil structure. The petrodollar arrangement since the 1970s has basically worked like this. Gulf oil is sold in dollars. The world needs oil, therefore the world needs dollars. Therefore the world keeps buying American debt and financing the United States. That is how America can carry debt at the scale it does. As long as the Gulf order holds, the dollar order holds. Now ask what happens if a U.S. ground invasion of Iran destabilizes the Gulf itself, who owns huge amounts of American debt. Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Europe, and where do Asia and Europe get much of their oil from the Gulf? From the same GCC states that would become deeply vulnerable if the conflict exploded, if the Gulf energy system becomes unreliable, if Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar can no longer guarantee the order underneath the petrodollar structure, then countries start thinking differently. They start hedging away from the dollar. They start buying less American debt. They stop treating the old system as sacred. And once that starts, the whole American financial architecture becomes much more fragile. The dollar weakens, borrowing costs rise, the stock market takes a hit. The AI bubble, already inflated by cheap money and optimism, starts to look very vulnerable. That is why I keep saying the real story is not simply whether America can beat Iran in a battle. The real story is whether trying to prove American control through a ground invasion would end up damaging the very system that made American power possible in the first place. Now, let me take you to the strangest part of the argument. What if some people around Trump already know the old system is dying? What if they believe the old American empire is exhausted, too indebted, too financialized, too dependent on protecting everybody else, too hollowed out by outsourcing, too weak internally? What if they are not really trying to save that order anymore? What if they are trying to collapse it faster and replace it with something else? I know that sounds insane, but follow the logic. When Hormuz closes, when the GCC gets destabilized, when Middle Eastern energy becomes unreliable, the world still needs oil. The world still needs food. The world still needs fertilizer. Those needs do not disappear. So where does the world turn? North America, the United States has oil. Canada has enormous reserves. Mexico matters. Venezuela matters. North America is rich in food, water, energy, and raw materials. If the Middle East becomes less stable, then Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, and even China become more dependent on North American resources. So what if the point is not to preserve the old empire? What if the point is to let the old global order break and then rebuild America as the fortress at the center of a more desperate world? This is where Hegseth's greater North America language becomes so important. Why Greenland? Why the Panama Canal? Why pressure on Canada and Mexico? Why Venezuela? Because this is not the language of a country trying to reassure the world that the liberal order will continue. This is the language of a country imagining a fortified continental bloc. I call it the technate, a self-sufficient North American fortress, oil, food, water, minerals, manufacturing potential, two oceans on either side, while Europe runs short of energy, while Asia fights oversupply, while the Middle East burns, North America sits behind its perimeter and sells resources to the rest of the world at a premium. Let me be very clear. I am not saying this is good. I am not saying this is moral. I am saying it has an internal logic. And that is why simply saying Trump is an idiot does not explain enough. A reckless man can still have a theory. A destructive strategy can still be coherent. In fact, some of the most dangerous strategies in history were coherent precisely because they accepted suffering as the cost of transformation. That is why I think the Putin comparison matters here. Look at what Russia did in Ukraine. The obvious reading was that Russia walked into a disaster, and yes, there were enormous costs. But another thing also happened. Russia used the war to militarize industrial production, increase defense manufacturing, adapt its economy, and harden its internal political order. The state used crisis to restructure itself. Then think about Alexander Dugin's worldview. Let the liberal order collapse. Do not save it. Build a harder civilizational bloc that survives the collapse better than everyone else. What if one faction in Washington has looked at that playbook and drawn its own lesson? Do not preserve the old order. Use crisis to bury it. Use war to justify a new one. Move from finance back to resources. Move from globalism back to the continent. Move from Pax Americana to Fortress North America. Then the Iran question changes completely. Now, the question is not just, can America beat Iran? Now, the question is whether a war with Iran could be used to accelerate the transition from a global American empire to a harder North American stronghold, and that leads us to the scenario tree. Scenario 1, America invades Iran, it gets bogged down, Iran stretches the war, Hormuz becomes more dangerous, oil spikes, food and chip supply chains get hit, the global economy slides into depression. America takes a historic strategic defeat in the Middle East. That is the nightmare outcome if your goal is to preserve the old empire. Scenario 2, America invades. The war still becomes ugly and expensive. The global order still cracks. But North America emerges as the most resource-rich and self-sufficient major region in an unstable world. In that version, America loses the old game, but tries to win the resource game that comes after the collapse. Scenario 3, the threat of invasion is itself part of the strategy, the reserve language, the prediction markets. The Pentagon preparation, all of it is used to force negotiations, reshape alliances, and psychologically prepare Americans for a much harder, more continental doctrine without actually committing to a full-scale occupation. That may be the most rational version available to them, because a true ground invasion could unleash costs too large for even its supporters to control. But in every scenario, one thing stays constant. The people who pay are the ordinary people, Americans who get drafted or deployed, Iranians who get bombed, displaced, and buried, people in poorer countries who suddenly cannot afford food, fuel, or fertilizer. That is the tragedy of empire. It is always ordinary people who pay. It is always the powerful who try to turn the crisis into advantage. So when someone asks me what happens if the United States invades Iran, my answer is this. First, the military operation becomes much uglier than its advocates are admitting. Second, the economic consequences spread far beyond Iran and far beyond America. Third, the deeper issue may not be Iran at all. The deeper issue may be whether one faction in Washington is trying to use this crisis to break the old American empire and replace it with something harder, smaller, more self-sufficient, and more brutal. And that is why this question matters so much, because if America invades Iran, we will not just be watching a war, we will be watching a test of whether the old American order is still being defended, or whether the people who claim to lead it are now preparing to bury it in the fire and build something else afterward.